Well, hey everybody, Pastor Steve here. So glad you've joined me for today's devotion from Romans chapter 12. And while you're opening your Bible there, I want to remind you one last time, if you've not picked up your new bookmark for the reading plan for the rest of this year, please do so this coming Sunday. We're getting near the end of the current reading plan. In fact, this week, this card is complete, and we pick up for the rest of the year with a new bookmark. So pick that up if you haven't done so already. I had to say, when I read chapter 12 of Romans this time, it was more meaningful for me than any time I've ever read it in my Christian life. And I believe that is because we've been working through Romans chapter by chapter, and I think the whole book meant more to me this time than any time before, and maybe on some level I grasped some of what Paul was saying more clearly than ever before. And I guess that context just caused this chapter to really, really speak to me. It took on special meaning because it's historically, we've always said, the first 11 chapters are theology, and then chapters 12 and following are all practical stuff. And it's like there's a sharp divide. But what I realized was chapter 12, which is very practical, flows out of the first 11 chapters. Yesterday, we talked about how he's saying that true Israel and the true spiritual descendants of Abraham are people who have faith. They are declared righteous by their faith, just like Abraham was, whether Jew or Gentile. And even though the Jews and the Gentiles have very different histories, they are one family. We are one family because of our faith in Jesus, disciples of Jesus, and therefore one is not to be arrogant toward the other or jealous of the other. And so with that background, especially from chapter 11, notice verse 12, chapter 12, verse 1, therefore I urge you, therefore. What that means is what he's getting ready to say, what he's urging them to do, grows out of the teaching he's done in the previous 11 chapters, and in particular chapter 11. So he says, hey, Christians, some of you are of Jewish backgrounds, others of you are of Gentile backgrounds, very different backgrounds, very different histories. But now you're family. Why? Because of your shared faith in Jesus. You're declared righteous because of your faith in Jesus. Don't be jealous of one another. Don't, in other words, love one another. He says, now, therefore, because that you're all grafted into the olive tree of God's family the same way through your faith in Jesus. Therefore, because even though you're different backgrounds, you're one people. Therefore, because of this, I urge you, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual, some Bibles say reasonable service, that sacrificing ourselves, surrendering ourselves as an act of sacrifice to God is an act of worship. Is an act of worship. And he says, all of you, whatever your background, all of you, because of your shared faith in Jesus, need to start thinking like God and think less like your little group. You came from this background, so you think that way. You came from over here, you think, hey, you need to do less of that. And you need to, all of you, because you're declared righteous through faith and you're part of this same olive tree, God's family, you need to present yourselves to God like a sacrifice and start thinking like God. So he says, don't be conformed to this world in verse 2, but instead transformed how? By the renewing of your mind. Change your thinking and begin thinking like God so that you can live out, demonstrate, prove, show God's will. And in verse 3, so have some humility. Because none of you got into the olive tree of God's family because you were good or because of who your ancestors were. You all got in there the same way. Your faith in Jesus. So have some humility. Verse 3, for through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, Jewish background Christians, Gentile background Christians, whatever group you come from, your heritage, I say to you, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think. Have some humility. And then he goes on to move into what we call spiritual gifts, our gifts and talents and abilities and so on. And he says, whatever your gifts are, they're grace gifts. They are an expression of the grace of God. God gave them to you. If you were born with a talent, it's because God gave you that talent as he wove your body in your mother's womb. And those don't exist for you alone, but for others, for the benefit of all. And he says in these verses about our gifting, he switches gears and uses the analogy of a human body. And my body has these fingers and hands and arms and my legs and my feet, my ears, my nose, my eyes, my mouth, my tongue, my heart, my lungs, my kidneys. Different parts making up one body. And all of you from these different backgrounds with these different gifts, you're one body, different parts, but one body, and the body needs those parts, and you are useless without the whole body. My hand is useless without the body. Okay? My body's useless without the heart. Feet don't do anything if they're not connected to my body. And so just like in chapter 11, he said, hey, you Jews and Gentiles who are now saved in Jesus, don't be arrogant toward one another or jealous. You're all in this tree, this olive tree, the same way by faith. Now he's saying, not only those different backgrounds, and here today, you grew up in the country, you grew up in the city, you grew up in the north, you grew up in the south, you grew up white, you grew up black. Who cares? If you're in the family, it's because of Jesus and your faith in him, and got nothing to do with your heritage. And here he says nothing to do with your talents or your skills. When people start thinking my group or your group's better than this group or my talents, and he said, haven't you all learned anything yet? God has worked to create out of all this diversity of people one family through a common faith. And don't you allow your backgrounds or your spiritual gift to make you think you're better than others, because you're not. You would not be in that olive tree if it were not for the grace of God and faith in Jesus Christ. So he says in verse 10, be devoted to one another. In verses 4 and 5, you are members of one another. Verse 16, you are to have the same mind toward one another. And in this little sermon I've just preached, how you treat other believers and how you think about other believers and how you feel about other believers matters in the eyes of God. And it matters in life as well. I told you, chapter 12 is practical, but it hinges on the theology and the truth of all he's been teaching in the first 11 chapters. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow, and hope you have a good evening.